Welcome back. Ooh. Are we ready to go? That's great. Well, thank you for coming back. Let me remind you that you do have in your package a form on which you can put your questions. And the reason for that is that it makes the question and answer period run more smoothly if we have your questions ahead of time. And Jim can sort through them and arrange them in an order and group them. So if there are similar questions, we just have to ask one, and then multiple questions are addressed at once. And so please take the time to fill out the form and ask a question. And I think our panelists will be more than happy. We're all history professors. We're all dealing with students all the time. And so we're used to getting questions we can't answer, and we know how to BS our way through some of them, and we know how to otherwise say, I don't know, but I'll look it up. So with that, let's go ahead and move on. I have then one other comment, and that is all of the lectures from all the previous symposia are on the website San Jacinto Conservancy, all one word, .org. So if you want to look at past programs, and I will only mention that last year the theme was Tejanos and the Texas Revolution, and yours truly was one of the speakers, and that one is now available also online. So all of the presentations are available if your curiosity has been piqued. Well, before the break, you got an Anglo-American perspective on westward movement, and we've tied the southeast of the United States to the eastern end of the Southwest in Texas. And you saw some patterns that from the Southeast that were repeated in Texas. And you also heard how some of these people who played a role in what happened in the Southeast also playing a role in Texas. So Texas does not happen, and the Texas Revolution does not happen in a vacuum. But it also didn't happen in a vacuum on the American Indian side. Patterns of change, patterns of migration, interactions among native peoples that took place in the Southeast are also moving west, and that's our next topic. Sherry Marie Shuck Hall, and let me tell you, for me, just being able to say that name correctly is an accomplishment, because I am a native Spanish speaker, and therefore my CHs and SHs are problematic, and so but I got it right, so I really appreciate that, and I know Sherry does. She teaches at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, where she is not only an associate professor of history, but also the director of the Public History Center there. Her last book, Mapping the Mississippian Shatter Zone, the European Invasion and Regional Instability in the American South, came out of the University of Nebraska Press in 2009. She is currently working on A Sudden Explosion of This Fanaticism, William Weatherford, Red Sticks Nativism, and the Creek War of 1813-1814, which is forthcoming in a volume titled 1812 in the Americas. And so already from those two titles, you know that there's this interplay between our speakers this morning that you really need to keep in mind as you try to understand what's going on here in Texas. She has worked on the Alabama Coushatta. She said it took her 10 years to get that work done. So it was a labor of love, obviously, and that's what she's going to talk to us this morning. So come on up, Sherry.
Thank you so much for the symposium organizers and the sponsors. I am just so grateful to be back in Texas once again. I am here to share with you the history of the immigrant tribes and their fight for land. Before I begin, I wanted to cover some questions just for you to consider as I go through this material. The first is, who were the Eastern tribes that migrated to Texas? And what were the tribes' strategies to preserve their land claims during the Texas Revolution? And also, what was the aftermath of the Texas victory for the tribes? And lastly, how was it that the Alabama Coushatta were able to remain in Texas while others were expelled? Looking at the Eastern tribes that migrated to Texas, by the first decade of the 19th century, many of the peoples that you see on this map here, including the Cherokee that later became known as the Western Cherokee, led principally by Duwali or Colonel Bowles, as well as the Alabama Coushatta, led by Chiefs Antone and Colita, respectively, as well as various factions or bands of the Shawnee, Delaware, and Kickapoo tribes. So why were they going and leaving their homelands from the east into the west? Mainly, these individuals were hoping to escape American encroachment onto their lands, as well as to preserve their sovereignty. So as a result, they slowly but surely moved into East Texas, and they recreated a homeland. And I think it's really important to focus on this because they settled in areas that were very familiar to the lands that they left behind. They were slightly different, but they settled in vast prairies with gently rolling hills interspersed with timber, numerous rivers, clear running streams, rich black soil, which was so critical for them because they were principally agriculturalists. And the interesting thing is that they also incorporated new game for hunting. They encountered buffalo. And there are a lot of travelogues that are published during this time period, mainly geared towards Americans to move them out into Texas. But they talk about how amazing the soil is, especially for good cotton land. And this wildly appeals to Southerners. But it also appeals to the Eastern tribes as well. So as they recreate their homeland, they also will bring their traditions with them. And some of the things that they do outside of just cultivating the land is they plant corn, traditional crops like peas, other vegetables. They also continue to raise cattle and horses on their land. Interestingly enough, a lot of archaeological digs have been conducted in East Texas, and they've actually found evidence suggesting that the Alabama Coushattas retained their ceramic technology. They obviously came from the areas of Alabama, and in their slow migration west, women continued to manufacture their own stoneware. Even though they could have traded at the local trading post for something that was similar, they instead preserved some of their heritage. Women also continued to weave baskets and from pine needles or grass, and this practice still exists today. So they use them to carry storage, use it for containers, and any time that they were faced with hardships in the bleak winter months, they simply went on various hunting trips out into the western territories. I do want to mention here that as they're moving west and they're adapting to this new environment, there's only so much farther that they can go. And they do realize this. I mean, East Texas was relatively familiar to them, but they knew inherently if they moved farther west, they would vastly have to change their lifestyle. And so for them, further migration, it's really not an option. Again, unless they want to erase a lot of their traditions and cultural practices. Now, Now, when they came out into East Texas, and when they're going on hunting trips, especially in the winter, they do find themselves at conflict with the residents that were already there. And in many ways, it was a true conflict over their hunting grounds that were already claimed by many. And these individuals were very formidable. It included the Comanches, the Wacos, the Wichitas, the Lipan Apaches, and others. And by 1830, these tribes numbered roughly 4,700. And if you consider the fact that the eastern tribes who are in East Texas, they number around 2,000. So they're outnumbered, and they're very worried. And because they are encroaching onto new hunting grounds, it's very clear to them that they are going to have some major conflict. And most of the conflict takes place in the forms of raiding. Comanches were very known for this. They would essentially attack the local settlements, and they would take their horses from them, or some of the cattle. So these eastern tribes, the one thing that they had a tradition of doing, and they did quite well, is they had a lot of experience with forming pan-Indian alliances. And these, in many ways, were very ephemeral in nature. They were unions, but they were flexible unions. And so it's no surprise that when they move into, to them, new territory, and they're facing a lot of conflict with the Western tribes, that the Eastern tribes actually saw as very savage. I mean, if you think about it, it's a true culture clash. You have the Eastern tribes who are settled, they're building log cabins, and they don't roam on horseback, and they're not, routinely going out on hunting trips. And so it was very familiar to them to look around and see that there are other Indian tribes that are very much like them. And so they build a pan-Indian alliance. And this is where Diwali comes into play. He is a very significant leader among the Western Cherokees. And March 1824, he sends out Chief Richard Fields. He's a diplomatic agent. And he goes out to the Alabamas, the Coushattas, the Shawnee, Delaware, and Kickapoos, and he essentially tells them, look, this is something that we should be focusing on, gathering us all together to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from potential raids, and they knew that if they are together, it makes them stronger. And again, this is something that they had done in the past. I mean, you could do this. You could look at this as something that had been done well before European settlement to the Americas. And I can't stress enough that this was a union of like-minded peoples. These individuals knew that if they were together, it would strengthen their hand, especially when dealing with other Indian agents, whether it be from the Mexicans or later the Texans. So the contest for land. Now this is going to start to get interesting in regards to, okay, what do we do with all this land and how can we keep it? Mexico had a very liberal immigration policy after their independence from Spain. And they were very concerned about the constant raids that they were suffering from by the Comanches and others. And so they opened Texas to all nationalities, in large part to have settlements act as a buffer and to protect them, again, from the raiding tribes. And it's very interesting to note that the Eastern tribes saw this as a potential opportunity. And on many occasions, they actually offered their aid and assistance to Mexico as long as the Mexicans would help them get permanent titles to their land. And they did so. Mexico, on various occasions, would actually assist them in the application process of these legal titles to land. On one occasion, for example, the Alabama Coushattas did not have enough money to hire a lawyer to help them process this. And so they gave them money, and they actually helped them apply for the land. And they didn't have enough stock to place on the land to essentially prove it was theirs, and they waived it. They waived this requirement. And so in this application to legal titles to their land, the Mexicans saw it as a good thing. The Mexicans viewed these tribes from the east as quote unquote civilized. This is something that they were willing to have these people on their borders and also as their friends. In fact, on various occasions, there's letters back and forth to Mexican agents and Diwali and others of the Union, and it says, we are trying to promote good order on this frontier. So Mexico is, in essence, helping them guarantee that they have actual ownership of that land. And it's interesting, on various occasions, on the eve of the Texas Revolution, the Alabamas and Coushattas, there were encroachers, white encroachers on their land, and they wrote to the Mexican government. And they said, well, I thought you promised that we're not going to have people just squatting on our land. And the Mexican government sends troops out and removes them. And so, to the Alabama Coushattas and other members of this union, as I refer to as the Western Cherokee Union, this was a good deal. This is something that was a source of strength and power to them. So in the Treaty of 1836 that was already alluded to, what exactly is happening? On the eve of the Texas Revolution, there are a lot of messages going back and forth between the Mexican Indian agents and members of the Western Cherokee Alliance. And they are being courted to act as raiders for the Mexican army. They are also being courted to act as friends and allies to the Mexican government. Anything to basically keep them in line with Mexican ties. And the tribes are courted very nicely, and interestingly enough, as part of their past, they played the middle. Who wouldn't if you're being courted by both? And they asked them, well, how many presents are you going to give me, and I'll stay out of whatever potentially is brewing on the frontier. So they're courted by Mexico, and eventually they're courted by Texas when the war erupts. The provisional government knows that this is happening, and they actually send General Houston, Sam Houston, John Forbes, and John Cameron to negotiate with the tribes. And they issue this in 1835 in November, and by February 23rd, 1836, everyone is together, and according to the provisions, Sam Houston and his fellow agents were directed to, quote, take all necessary measures in their power for the accomplishment of the end of actually having the Cherokee Union members as allies. Now, as Sam Houston is negotiating this treaty, he knows that it's going to be very difficult to convince Diwali and others to essentially, stop playing the middle and actually make the sign of their alliance. But Sam Houston has a very special relationship with the Cherokees. He's very well respected based on his earlier experiences in Tennessee, and they trust him. And he makes sure that Diwali knows, and the others who are negotiating this treaty, that he will always protect them. And in fact, in many occasions, he states in various speeches, he says, all of my red brothers must rest satisfied that I will always hold you by the hand and look to you as brothers and treat you as such. And the Western Cherokee Union members agreed. They believed him. So in this negotiation, unfortunately, you really can't see it in this screen here, but you can see the Indian lands in the Treaty of 1836 with the arrow pointing here. But there is a small section of land that was reserved to them by this treaty. And the Cherokees and others, they're thinking this is not exactly where we want to go. It was a little bit farther south than where they were thinking, and of course it wasn't as large of a reserve as they had wanted, but the tribal leaders agreed that this was a pretty good move. In many ways it protected them, just in case the Texans won the war. And especially looking at it from the other perspective, they knew that the Mexicans had also overall protected their lands from the past. So they're thinking, this is relatively a good strategy to move forward. In Sam Houston's leadership, he was very interested in preserving that union. And he definitely guaranteed that they would have a permanent security in many ways to those lands. In general, the immigrant tribes mostly stayed out of the war. But I do want to stress that Diwali and other chiefs of the tribes, they did not have dictatorial power. And so there were plenty of opportunities for especially young men to go out and become scouts for the Mexicans or the Texans. And so there are accounts of Coushatta warriors who are actually during the Texas Revolution fighting on the side of the Mexicans. But there were Chief Colita and others. They're like, well, we can't control our young men. But there is a very famous Alabama Coushatta recollection describing the morning of April 18th, 1836, and it's essentially part of their oral tradition. And it's Chief Colita and the runaway scrape. So according to their storytellers, it suggests that the Texans living near the Brazos River were fleeing from their settlements when they found out that Santa Anna's army is marching towards them. And refugees reach the Trinity River, the ferry boat is gone, and the water had become a very dangerous rapid. And they were unable to cross it safely. So in this oral tradition, Chief Colita the Texans are really worried they're not going to be able to escape. Chief Colita comes out from a distance, and he's on the bluff on horseback, and you can almost imagine what he looks like, this grand figure. And he starts to come down the ravine, and he booms this greeting of welcome, I'm here to help you, and he extends his hand. And according to the tradition, the Texans, quote, rang with their shouts of rejoicing. So they're really excited to see him. Colita then instructs his people to cut down the trees to make a raft, and Colita personally escorts him, all the different Texans, across the Trinity safely, and the Coushatta women, they help feed the starving families, the Texan families. And 4 days later, Chief Colita catches up with the Texans and tells them about the victory at San Jacinto. And according to the oral tradition, Colita became a hero and friend of the Texans from that point forward. And that's something to remember as we go through. The Cordova Rebellion of 1838. So, interestingly enough, when you have the Texas Revolution, the fact that it was such a decisive victory, and it was a really short war. The Texans were able to defeat the Mexicans in many ways very quickly. And so after the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836, the Republic of Texas won its independence. And in many ways, it spelled disaster for the immigrant tribes. They were no longer being courted by two countries, and in many ways, they lost their negotiating power. They were left very vulnerable. No one really wanted their friendship anymore. And in fact, if anything, they stood in the way. So the treaty goes before the Texas Senate, and it's refused. They refused to ratify it. The Texas senators stated that Houston and his party had no authority to make such, quote, extravagant promises to the immigrant tribes, and so it should be nullified. And in their perspective, the Republic had no obligation to honor this treaty. I mean, why should they? So they denied the land to the tribes. And in fact, it actually became quite an issue when the land office began to release patents for the lands that were promised to the tribes. And there is a rush of Anglo settlers onto these lands, and it caused a lot of conflict, as well as various attacks on settlements. So this is where Vicente Cordova comes in to play. He is a former judge and advocate of the Mexican-controlled Texas, and he meets with Diwali and other chiefs of the immigrant tribes on July 9th, 1838. And according to Mexican accounts, the immigrant tribes agreed to, quote, unite as soon as possible for action. Now later, Diwali would definitely say that never happened. he would basically profess his innocence in this whole affair to at least Sam Houston. But if you're looking at the Cordova Rebellion from their perspective, Cordova and Mexico, the Mexican government, they offer anyone involved that is essentially going to wage war fee simple titles to land. And it's this idea that, you know, the Treaty of 1836 will never go through. What opportunities do they have at this point until Cordova comes in and saying, we are actually going to give you our lands, your lands, and protect you. And so for the immigrant tribes, I think, you know, it definitely looked or appeared like a pretty good deal. So there were a number of Cherokees, Kickapoos, and others, there were some Coushattas as well, who raided and destroyed Texas settlements, probably as part of this agreement. Now, whether or not it was formalized, it's still up for question. There are a lot of documents suggesting that you know, there was a larger conspiracy at play here, that essentially the Mexican troops were going to come and assist Cordova, but they never came. And in fact, Sam Houston, as this is starting to brew, Sam Houston catches wind of this, and he writes to Diwali, and he pleads with them. And he also pleads with Chief Colita of the Coushattas and Antone of the Alabamas, and he tells them, stay out of the revolt, that they should stay out of the fight, and he warns them that it's going to spell ultimate disaster for you if you get involved. And in fact, he knew that the treaty was on the line. He knew that this was really what was at question, the fact that the Texas senators would not ratify it. And so he states in a letter to Diwali, he says, quote, I will never lie to that treaty while I live, and it must stand as long as good men live and water runs. It's very powerful. But I don't think Diwali was so convinced. I mean, he knew that even if Houston was good to his word, Houston could only go so far. In many ways, the Cordova Rebellion was doomed to fail before it started. It was mostly a local revolt based in Nacogdoches. I mean, at first they had about 40 Tejanos and 200 Indians, and again, it was very local in nature. That a lot of raids were conducted on Anglo farmsteads for supplies and foods, but it never really became a large war. So in many ways, the Texans were able to extinguish it rather quickly. But most of the Indians who were involved were members of the Western Cherokee Union. And so even if Diwali never signed any official agreement with the Mexican government stating that I am now your ally, not, you know, I basically disavow my friendship with the Texans, it doesn't matter. There's still enough evidence to suggest to the Texans and the Texas government that they are on the wrong side. They're on the losing side. And in Sam Houston's perspective, he looks at the Cordova Rebellion as a major conflict that was temporarily avoided. He knows that there are a lot of pressing issues of land claims for the tribes, and it remains unresolved. War had been averted for the time being, but an Indian war, a larger Indian war, was on the horizon. And in Sam Houston's perspective, it's very interesting, it's very telling of who he was and how he felt about the reneging of the agreement that he had made by the Texas senators. He said that the bloodshed of the Cordova Rebellion, quote, will rest upon our own shoulders because white encroachment was done in the face of a pledge made to the Indians by this government at the darkest hour ever known to the citizens of Texas. And so he is really disappointed by the fact that he put his word to this treaty and now it's not going to go through. And he knows there's going to be a bigger Indian war ahead. Now, when Lamar takes office, he is going to take a much harder stance against the Indians. And his Indian policy is looking at it in terms of the revolt being a direct threat to the new government, especially as him as president. And so as a result, he really pushes for the end of all clemency towards the Indians. And in many ways, he is reversing what Sam Houston was trying to do, which was to sign peace agreements with the different tribes and to allow them to remain in Texas. And Lamar stated that, quote, "As long as we continue to exhibit our mercy without showing our strength, so long will the Indian continue to bloody the edge of the tomahawk." And this is where he calls upon an exterminating war upon their warriors. Those are his own words. It's a pretty, shocking quote. But his viewpoint is very similar to a lot of Americans and Texans of the time. They do not see the ability for all the different American Indian tribes to be able to coexist with whites, and in this case, Texans. So he pushes for their removal into Indian territory. And he basically says, look, you can go to Indian territory on your own, or we will forcibly remove you, and there will be death as a result. So Diwali immediately comes up with a plea for peace. He writes to Lamar, and he expressed his hope that, quote, "It would not be long before we shall see our children grow up together in peace. It is my wish for all of us to do the best we can and live friendly together as brothers should." But this doesn't happen. Lamar's response was that he called for the immediate removal of the tribes. And this letter here is essentially describing the fact that he is calling for their expulsion from Texas. And he believes that really no one deserves to be in this area, that they should all remove to Indian territory. So it was really too late in many ways for the essential peaceful residents of these two groups. There's a lot of hatred and fear between the two cultures, and it really prevents this cohabitation. And in fact, when Sam Houston questions Lamar and his new policy, Lamar simply goes back to the Cordova Rebellion and he says, look, these people were warring against us in our settlements. And so he claims that all the different Texas tribes, that they had no legitimate right of soil or sovereignty in this country. It was something that he could always fall back on, because there were a lot of warriors who fought for Cordova. And so he could always blame them and say, actually, they started it and we're just going to respond. Now, Chief Kalita also had a message. And I have to say, out of all the research I've ever done, and I've done an extensive amount of research, this is the most powerful speech by an American Indian I've ever come across. And it's the only full block quote that I have in my entire book. So I'm going to relate it here, because I think it's very powerful to show what exactly they were thinking. So this is from Chief Kalita in May of 1839, knowing that his people are going to be removed, even though he was the one that helped Texans fleeing in the runaway scrape. So he begins, "I have given the white man my lands. I have given them bread. And the former big captain, Sam Houston, told me that the white man should be my friends. The white man lies. They are doing evil for good. I am for peace, and all my Indians are for peace. And if your big captain, Mirabeau Lamar, is determined to murder us and destroy our property, we will be compelled to surrender and die like a brave nation should do. Times was when we could have driven the white man off, but we were their friends and did not want to hurt the white man. I will live here till I die, which cannot be long, and I want to know what is to become of my people." So in this message, Chief Kalita really doesn't know what's going to happen. And he does assume that his people will be removed to Indian territory, and it will be such a different change to their lifestyle. and he's very concerned. Now, of course, after Chief Coushatta writes this message, it really just goes unanswered. But the Cherokees, they moved forward. And Lamars' implementation of removal was very quick. Many of the Cherokees decided to escape to Indian Territory with Peace Chief Big Mush. And so a number of them were already removed before the Cherokee War of 1839. Those that remain were roughly about 150. And most of them are young men. In fact, some descriptions call them boys. And they stayed to fight. They resisted the troops that were sent to escort them to Indian Territory, and Diwali was going to lead them. They were entrenched in a ravine along the Neches River. And in many ways, I like to refer to this as the Cherokees' last stand. It was Diwali's last stand. And he was able to get the aid of some of the Shawnees, some of the Delawares, Kickapoos, and a few Coushattas, July 16th, 1839. And as they were entrenched along the Neches River, they were severely outnumbered, 3-1. So this is not good. And I think in some ways they knew that they probably wouldn't make it out of here alive. So Rusk, Thomas Jefferson Rusk, was in control of the militia. They sounded the charge, and the Texans quickly entered the ravine. The Cherokees did some damage with their trade muskets, and they were able to hold them off for a short period of time, but they were really no match for them, and their losses mounted. Diwali, who was wearing his very famous hat here and a bright coat, and he was also holding a special cane, they were all given to him by Sam Houston, according to accounts. He was shot on horseback, and so he got off his horse, and according to the records, he sat down in front of a cooking fire until a Texas soldier approached him and shot the chief in the head at very close range, leaving his body on the field. And according to various newspaper accounts, it was left there for some time, up to 20 years in some accounts. Soldiers raided the villages, now vacant and abandoned, and these lands would be prime settlement for sale. The important point to remember about the Cherokee War of 1839 is that this was not only Diwali's last stand, but it was truly the end of the Western Cherokee dominance. With Diwali's death, and Diwali, I should mention, he definitely claimed to be the main or the principal leader of the Western Cherokee Union. When he dies, there's not much they can do. The survivors are driven across the Texas borders, and his own son was killed as well as he was trying to lead some of the Cherokees down into Mexico. So what was the Alabama Coushatta strategy? They took a different approach. There were some Coushattas who were involved in the Cherokee War, but not all of them. The Coushattas were left vulnerable and sick as they wandered through East Texas and Louisiana, especially after the Treaty of 1836 was not ratified. All of a sudden, there is a flood of Anglos, mostly coming from the South, who started squatting on their lands, and they are literally pushed out. I mean, no one's going to protect them. And so they flee. Some of them go back to Louisiana, where some of their kinspeople had remained and still remain today. But there was a lot of sickness there, and so they went back into East Texas. And they're searching for available land. Their strategy is really unique in that Chief Coushatta, and by the way, Chief Coushatta at this point, according to some of the letters, he's almost 100 years old, so he's pretty old. In 1843, Chief Coushatta and a group of Alabama Coushattas, they camp on Sam Houston's land in Washington, Texas. And so what do? They appeal to his wife, Margaret. And interestingly enough, Chief Coushatta tells Margaret that we're not going to leave until Sam Houston comes back and basically, rights the wrongs against our tribe. And they do. I mean, they stay there for about a year. They're just camping on their lands. And it's really interesting if you look at the cultural significance of their visit and their stay on Sam Houston's land. In Alabama Coushatta society, it's matrilineal, and at this point it's somewhat still matrilocal as well. Women have power. And so, of course, what are they going to do if they're disappointed with someone? They go to his wife. And it was, in many ways, it's a brilliant move on their part. And it works. She writes to Sam Houston, and she writes to her husband, and she's like, these people are dying by the day. You've got women and children, and they're starving, and they're on our land. When are you going to come home and fix this? And it does take him a while to get back, but when he finally does, he sets aside some temporary land for the Alabama Coushattas to live on, and until a reserve was identified in Livingston, Texas. And interestingly enough, they did receive some support by the local community, who helped sign a petition on behalf of the tribe, calling them, quote, friendly, peaceful, and civilized. In fact, the historical marker does say the Alabama and Coushatta Indians who came into Texas, and they were always our friends. So it's very interesting that they have that appeal. So Chief Antone, who is the one who would later negotiate with Sam Houston, because Chief Colita died before they received a permanent land reserve in Texas. But Chief Antone disassociates himself and his people from the Cherokee and others. And the Alabama Coushatta tribe becomes essentially the first and at least only recipient in the 19th century of a state-regulated reservation in 1854. As the negotiations were taking place, it is interesting that Sam Houston is there when they're figuring out where exactly they're going to live. Chief Antone is very forceful about where exactly he wants to be. He, according to the records, he wants to be in the Big Sandy. He actually finds that this land is just fine for them. It's very suitable for them. And the Texas agents, they asked Chief Antone, they said, so are you sure you're not willing to go to Indian Territory? And in the letter, Chief Antone says, we are not, and it's underlined, not willing to go there. And so he's very adamant about making sure that he and his people stay in Texas. Now, when they finally receive the land, it's roughly 1,100 acres, and it really pales in comparison to what they had claimed. But it was a start. It was a good start. And in 1862, most of the remaining Coushattas who had been wandering all throughout either East Texas or in and out of Louisiana, they actually joined their kinspeople on the reserve, and they were very welcomed there by the Alabamas. So then how is it that the Alabama Coushattas were able to keep their land? Everyone else was expelled. And before I answer this question, I want to share with you the Alabama Coushatta folktale of the rabbit who outwitted the buffalo. I want you to think about it as I'm describing it. So one day, a rabbit challenged a buffalo to a tug-of-war contest to see who was stronger. When the buffalo agreed, thinking, the rabbit, I'm going to be able to win this contest pretty easily, the rabbit left the end of a very long grapevine with the buffalo, and he ran to the other side over a hill, and he found another buffalo, and he challenged him to the same contest. And of course, the buffalo was like, absolutely, I'll do this. And he leaves the other end of the grapevine with the other buffalo. So the rabbit ran to the middle, he actually hid, tugged the vine, and then began the contest. And so the buffalo, they're jerking back and forth, and this takes a while, and the buffalo are thinking, why is this taking so long? It's just a rabbit on the other end. So they get suspicious. And as they get suspicious, they slowly walk up the hill, and they saw each other instead of the rabbit. And the rabbit runs away, knowing that he's been caught. So the buffalo, they agreed to punish the rabbit and prevented him from drinking any water, which the buffalo controlled. When the rabbit tried to drink, the buffalo ordered him off the land. Yet, clever rabbit found a fawn's skin, placed it over himself, and went to the water and began crying. So the buffalo came over and said, "Why are you crying, rabbit?" And the rabbit, again, he's got the fawn skin over him. He said, "Yeah, I was told that the buffalo prevents all animals from drinking water." And buffalo said, "It is only rabbit who cannot drink. You can always get all the water that you want." So rabbit, still disguised as a deer, then happily drank the water and later told everyone how he had fooled the buffalo. So, as you may suspect, the rabbit is one of the most beloved heroes in tribal lore. And this oral tradition was passed down through generations of Alabama Coushattas. And I see it as very symbolic of their experience in the first half of the 19th century. Many perceive them as weak, just like the rabbit, because for the Alabama Coushattas, they weren't as numerous as other tribes that surrounded them. And the rabbit's contrived contest between the two buffalo can be a metaphor of the Alabama Coushattas' ability to play off two nations that were gaining strength, Mexico and Texas, and later the United States. And the Alabamas and Coushattas, they always stayed in the middle, as their ancestors had done in the past. And like their allies, they often were able to play the middle when it worked. But for the Alabama Coushattas, through expert diplomacy, they were able to emerge with their sovereignty and a permanent title to their lands in East Texas. The remaining tribes, however, did not fare as well. In many ways, you had the Shawnee, Delaware, Kickapoo, and others. They just scattered into Indian territory. And they were truly unable to ever disassociate themselves from the Cordova Rebellion or the Cherokee War, and they lacked leaders connected to Sam Houston, especially after the death of Diwali in 1839. And they could never gain the support of the Texas citizenry as the Alabama Coushattas. All of the people, including the Alabamas and Coushattas, they did face extreme hardship. I mean, just because the Alabama Coushattas remain in East Texas, their land was constantly being encroached upon, and they forever had to appeal to the Texas state governors. Those, I mean, actually, for generations, they were constantly having to hold on to their lands. But they always had the protection, in many ways, of the local citizenry. They actually stuck up for them quite a bit. In one case, there was an Indian agent appointed to the Alabama Coushattas, and he didn't speak their language. And the Liberty County citizens appealed to the Texas agents, and they said, "You need to get rid of this guy because he doesn't know what they're doing." So all of these people faced extreme hardships in the years ahead, but they are mostly able to keep their identity intact, even in Indian territory. I mean, it's a very slow progression. And they deeply remained connected to the land that they had and now occupy. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here for this morning's program. My duties are just about at an end, except to tell you that lunch is being served as you walk out these doors to the left. You please bring them back in here to eat, and as lunch is substantially underway, the lunchtime program will begin, and Graham Painter will handle the hosting duties at that point. So thank you, and see you on the lunch line.